How's it going everyone, and welcome to my very first simple guide starting off with how to Cartethiya. Now there will be timestamps in the description below, but we will be going over the basics, Fleurdelys, erosion, sequences, as well as Fleurdelys's combos to bring her energy up to max as quick as possible. Now the purpose of this guide will be to give you the fundamentals of how our character works, so by the end of the video you will have a good and well understanding of how to use them, just from this guide explaining it very simply and clearly to you, so it's very easily digestible and you don't have to have a PhD and a black belt to be able to understand her 500-page kit. And with all that being said, we will first begin with the basics, specifically her basic attack combo. With the basic attack combo, it is a 4 basic attack string. So after doing 4 basic attacks, the very last attack will apply erosion to any enemies hit by that last hit, as well as summon Sword of Divinity's Shadow. Now these swords do nothing while they are on the field, but they do last for 20 seconds. The forte meter also shows you and indicates which one is currently active on the field, with the middle sword indicating the basic attack sword, the left symbol indicating the heavy attack sword, and the right symbol indicating the resonance skill sword. As we are showing some gameplay footage here of the basic attack, you will notice that doing basic attack 3 just ping-pongs enemies around, which is really cool if you want to control the battle and group enemies together. And of course, as well as not only the third attack being very useful, but the fourth basic attack also applies 1 stack of erosion to the enemy. Furthermore, if you end up dodging the enemy's attack and then doing a basic attack right after, you go right into the third and fourth string of the basic attack combo, making you ping pong as well as deal erosion damage to the enemies much more quicker, making this very useful, so make sure you brush up on your dodging. We will now be moving on to her heavy attack. Just holding the basic attack button will make her do a heavy attack, summoning 1 Sword of Discord's Shadow. And just like the other one, this can only exist for 20 seconds. It is also considered basic attack damage and can be performed in the air, giving the heavy attack more versatility. We will now move on to the resonance skill. When you use Cartethiya's resonance skill, it will make a huge AoE around her, dealing 2 stacks of arrow erosion damage to any enemies that are hit by it. This will also lift enemies off the ground into the air, assuming that they aren't tanky and aren't heavy enemies. And we will also be getting our very last sword, the Sword of Virtue Shadow buff. Now what these swords do is they have 2 functions. One is increases Cartethiya's plunge attack damage and radius, and the second is when you jump and plunge attack, you consume the sword buff and add it to your forte meter permanently. You can have up to 3 different sword buffs on the field at the same time, with each one increasing the radius and strength of her plunge attack, while also giving a specific buff to Fleurdelys. Now with all of that information, we are going to break that down so we can go over what we have learned so far to not make it as confusing as it might seem. It might seem a little overwhelming at first, but let's break it down to where it's much more easier to understand. With Cartethiya's basic attacks, her third basic attack will ping pong enemies, her fourth will inflict arrow erosion to the enemy's hit, and she will summon the Sword of Divinity's Shadow. Her heavy attack will summon a Sword of Discord's Shadow. This heavy attack can also be performed in mid-air and is considered a basic attack damage. The Resonance skill does a big AoE around her, lifting enemies into the air if they are weak enough, and applies 2 arrow erosion stacks on the enemy's hit, while also giving us our last sword buff, the Sword of Virtue's Shadow. And last and not least, Cartethia's Plunge attack, which when done, depending on how many swords you currently have active on the field, these will increase the damage and radius of the plunge attack. This will also consume all the current swords that are on the field and add them to your forte bar permanently. You can keep summoning these swords as many times as you like and using the plunge attack to consume them, but you can only benefit from these buffs if you are in your Fleurdelys state. And with that, we will now be doing a visual breakdown of what we have done so far. So we will visually be doing everything that we have done, so we have a clearer understanding of how everything works and how it happens. So let's finish this basic part of the guide so we can continue. Now do keep in mind that because we ended up using our skill last, this also means that we can hover and delay our plunge if you really wanted to. Alternatively, we can also do basic ×4 skill, then heavy and plunge if you wanted to. This is also a very viable option. A cool little fun fact, did you know that her crown, as well as the thorns that are around her wrist and her ankles, they all glow when you have your forte meter filled with your sword buffs? How cool is that? And now we will be moving on to the Fleurdelys part of the guide. So because we're going to be moving on to Fleurdelys, the buffs are actually going to change and benefit her. So we will be changing into Fleurdelys and then going over each sword buff and how they benefit her in her form.
True form revealed at last.
Now do keep in mind the sword buffs only last for about 12 seconds, and the indication for them are the 3 swords on her side, and beneath her forte meter you can see that she does have these specific markings that kind of go down over time to indicate just how much time you have left. So do keep that in mind whenever you do switch to Fleurdelys, because there is a time limit to these buffs, so make sure you make the most of them while you can. So the very first buff that we're going to be talking about is the Heart of Virtue buff. Now do keep in mind that all these buffs will only last for 12 seconds, so keep that in mind. Her 4th ground basic attack will stagnate the targets within range, as well as Fleurdelys' resistance to interruption increases as well. Now we are going to try this in the tower at the moment, so we can do our basic opener that we've been practicing, and we're going to go into Fleurdelys, and we're going to see if we can get some basic attacks going. And as we can see, he kind of stuns himself and limps a little bit whenever we do it, so that's pretty cool. For our second sword buff, we will be talking about the Mandate of Divinity. What the Mandate of Divinity does is arrow erosion damage is amplified by 50%, and its damage interval is decreased by 50% for enemies within a certain distance from Fleurdelys. Now do keep in mind, because these are still the sword buffs, this will only last for 12 seconds, but let's see some gameplay footage and see what this does. Now to understand how this works, we will also need to be going over some arrow erosion basics. Now with arrow erosion, it is considered a dot, or damage over time. Normally this is considered either a debuff or a negative status. Now in Withering Waves, this is considered a negative status, with some of the negative statuses including Spectro-Frazzle, Havoc Bane, Fusion Burst, Glacier Chaff, and Electro Flare. We only have Spectro-Frazzle and Aero Erosion at the moment, but how they work is for Aero Erosion specifically, when you apply this to an enemy with a character that can use Aero Erosion, the enemy takes a specific amount of damage every 5 seconds. For Aero Erosion specifically, it only lasts for 15 seconds if you don't reapply it. Now how the damage works is depending on the amount of stacks of Aero Erosion you have applied to the enemy, will depend on the amount of damage they take, from anywhere ranging between 800 for 1 stack of Aero Erosion all the way to 9. So when they have 9 stacks of Erosion, you could expect damage to be doing anywhere from 30 to 50,000 damage every 5 seconds. Now that we know the fundamentals of dot damage, especially Aero Erosion, we can continue with Fleurdelys' kit and jump back to Mandate of Divinity. Now with the Mandate of Divinity, don't forget it's amplified by 50% for the Aero Erosion damage, which is the dot damage, and reduces the interval, making it so they take dot damage every 2 seconds instead of every 5 seconds. Now what this means is if you end up going into Fleurdelys with your sword buffs active and having a high erosion count on the enemies, the damage from the dot themselves would be the equivalent of having another main DPS on your team while it's active. So this is why we apply all the sword buffs before turning into Fleurdelys, because they make such a drastic difference in her damage. Do keep in mind that this doesn't also take into the fact Chacona and her outro's damage, which will also amplify the dot damage even further, practically doubling the damage of what it's capable of. And finally, we will be talking about the power of Discord, her final sword buff. And just like the other two, this will only last for 12 seconds, so keep that in mind. When doing Fleurdelys' final ground basic attack, so stage 5, her very last attack, her mid-air second basic attack hit, her heavy attack string, as well as her second part of her resonance skill that we need to go over shortly. Keep in mind that her resonance skill has 2 parts, so it has 2 button presses. This means that the resonance skill May Tempest Break the Tides is the second skill button press, not the first one. What this does is when any of these attacks land on an enemy during the sword buff, raise the Aero Erosion stacks on all nearby targets to the highest count among the targets. Simplifying this would mean that if you had an enemy that had 6 stacks of Erosion and the others had much less, performing any of these attacks will make all the other enemies surrounding that 6 stack enemy also get 6 stacks as well, turning Fleurdelys into an amazing unit to spread her dots to other enemies. Before we move on, we are going to look at switching between Fleurdelys and Cartethiya. How to switch between Cartethiya and Fleurdelys on the fly. This is only possible if Fleurdelys still has her buff timer remaining. So within those 12 seconds, if you haven't got your liberation fully maxed out, pressing the liberation will switch you back to Cartethiya and Fleurdelys, also pausing the sword buff duration. So if you ended up killing the enemies a little bit too quickly, you can quickly switch back to Cartethiya to save your remaining sword buff duration for when more enemies appear. Do keep in mind you do have to switch back to Cartethiya to pause the timer. If you end up switching to another character while you are in the Fleurdelys state, the timer will still continue to drop and will disappear. When you end up switching back to Cartethiya when your buffs are finished, you will not be able to switch back to Fleurdelys until your energy is maxed out once again and you transform. To summarize everything much more simply, make sure you obtain all the sword buffs before switching to Fleurdelys, as these sword buffs will make her extremely strong for 12 seconds. Aero Erosion lasts for 15 seconds, doing damage every 5 seconds, increasing the damage it does for every stack the enemy has. Do keep in mind that Fleurdelys and Cartethiya will do more damage for every stack of erosion the enemy has, up to 6 stacks, to give you 60% extra damage. We will now transition into the sequences. Now, there is a lot of positive and negative about these sequences, specifically two sequences being S2 and S3, but we will look over them together. Now, S1 is a lot similar to the Power of Discord that we went over with her sword buffs, but instead of her attacks transferring the stacks of erosion to other enemies, S1 lets you transfer the defeated enemy with the highest stack of erosion and make them spread their erosion to the other enemies. In simple terms, this just means that if you defeat an enemy that has 6 stacks of aero erosion, the next enemy that you attack will also gain 6 stacks of erosion. With the second part of the S1, basically this states for every 30% of your energy meter that is filled by Fleurdelys, you gain 25% extra crit damage, which means when you fill up her meter completely and her energy is maxed, she gains 100% crit damage, with the indication for this being right above your forte meter, showing you how much stacks you actually have. Do keep in mind that they do all share the exact same timer, so as soon as you get your very first buff, you have 15 seconds to get all 4 buffs and do your liberation for maximum damage. S2 is also one of the big ones that we have to mention. When you have your energy maxed out as Cartethiya and switch into Fleurdelys, the default amount of area erosion stacks goes up by 3 for all the enemies around you, and your next attack as Fleurdelys will instantly apply 3 erosion stacks to the enemy hit. S2 will also make it so where you can reach 9 stacks of aero erosion if you use Rover. If you also had Chacona, these numbers could even reach into the 40,000s and further. While the rest of the sequence also turns Cartethiya into a DPS character, where not only does her damage increase, but once all 3 swords are on the field and you plunge, she does absolute crazy damage, having absolute no problem just nuking the field. The last part of this S2 also making it to where each sword that you consume will reduce the cooldown of the resonance skill by 1 second. Basically giving you the ability to spam the 3 sword combo into the plunge a lot more often. And because S2 lets you have 6 stacks of area erosion by default without Rover, also allows you to replace Rover if you really wanted to. We will now move on to S3, final basic attack on the ground as well as your second attack in the air, your heavy attack and your second resonance skill will now give you the opportunity to make Cartethiya completely independent, or should I say Fleurdelys completely independent, because Fleurdelys can now generate her own erosion stacks when she attacks and does skills. Not only will she keep the erosion stacks completely maxed out all the time, dealing the most dot damage possible, not only that, but you will also have full uptime on her talent buff, making it to where she does not need any kind of help from any teammate whatsoever. So if you were looking for a Chacona replacement or a Rover replacement, her S3 will basically put her on par with most S6 characters. Will also double the damage of her liberation. Now, if you wanted to invest in Cartethiya and you're wondering where to stop, S3 is the big stopping point. It doesn't just make her into a solo DPS character, but it makes her completely flexible with her teams. S4 is a slight bump in damage, but nothing too crazy. I would not recommend you go to S4 specifically just for this slight damage boost. When you get to S5, when you take a fatal blow, so once your health drops to 0, you will get a small shield to keep you from dying, going, I highly recommend you activate your liberation right after this happens to give your HP back so you can survive, and also the liberation to go into Fleurdelys. Now normally it will take about 50% of your HP to go into Fleurdelys, but with S5 it reduces it to 25% instead. As nice as this is, compared to the first 3 sequences, this does not really feel worth the extra copy. Now we go into our final sequence, the S6. When you are in Fleurdelys and you activate your liberation and do your final move, anything that is hit or anything that is survived will also get applied maximum erosion stacks done to the enemy. Depending on your situation and if you have Rover's outro activated at the time, every enemy that you hit will either get 9 stacks of erosion applied to them, 6 depending on the situation, or 3 depending if you have Fleurdelys's S2 active at the time. Now as for the second part of this S6, for 30 seconds after casting your intro skill or liberation as Cartethiya or Fleurdelys. Now we are aware that it takes 5 seconds for Aero Erosion to actually proc its damage, but what S6 lets you do is every time you reapply or refresh the stack once you have reached the maximum amount of Aero Erosion you can apply to the enemy, this will bypass the 5-second timer and automatically activate the proc damage to happen instantly. Combining this with Chokona and Rover, because Chokona is constantly applying Aero Erosion from her liberation and you are also applying Aero Erosion as Fleurdelys, it is very possible to put out some very disgusting numbers at a very quick pace. Now the only issue with this is that there is nothing in the game that can survive long enough where this is necessary. They will also take an extra 40% extra damage from Fleurdelys by default. Now I don't think S6 is really necessary. If you do have S3, honestly the damage difference right now in the game would only be seconds. I don't think an extra 3 more copies for S6 is worth getting. If you can beat the tower at 56 seconds at S3, I don't think beating the tower at 53 seconds is worth the extra 3 copies. And last and very not least, we will be going over the energy combos as Fleurdelys. Now there are different ways you can do these, but there is one very specific one that is basically guaranteed for you to get you full energy very quickly and for it to practically be 100% accurate. Now I have never seen this combo ever not get 100%, and now I am gonna teach all of you how to do it as well. Now do not be intimidated by how this looks, it is a lot more easier than it actually looks. How this is done is we will first start off with a heavy attack and then press basic attack twice. This will take us into the air automatically, and then we press basic attack 4 more times while we are in the air. We will also do a skill right afterwards which will reset the air combo. If you're wondering for an easier indication, when she does black slashes, that's when you press the skill. We will then do basic attack 5 times until she ends the combo into the ground, and then we will finish it off with a skill to finish the combo. How cool was that? Now we will be going through it again in slow motion, and I kind of talk you through it as it's happening. Now the reason why this combo is really good is every single attack in this combo is a homing attack. The heavy will lunge at the enemy. She then follows up with a projectile to guarantee hit the enemy. Then she will lunge forward and jump into the air while also hitting the enemy. The 4 attacks in the air actually track the enemy, so if they are on your left, to your right, beneath you, she will still hit them. If the enemy is a distance away, this skill will also hit them in a big AoE. The basic attacks all the way to 5 will still home to the the enemies and track the enemies, and then you can do a skill once you hit the ground to finish the combo. Now let's take another look together. She will now do a heavy and she will lunge towards the enemy. We will do 2 basics, that's the projectile. She will now lunge up and we will keep tapping the basic until we see the black slash and then press our skill. Now we will continue to tap our basic attack all the way until the very end of the combo. So she will go straight down, and then as soon as we hit the ground, we press the skill the second time, and bang! That is the end of the combo. Now we will be seeing it in action in the tower. Another easier way to actually see this would be to do a heavy and then just keep tapping the basic attack button until you see the black slashes. Press the skill. Keep pressing the basic attack until the very last plunge and then skill again, ending it with the liberation. And just like that, we deleted his HP completely without even trying. Now this is my personal go-to combo and the one I personally only use because of how easy it is and how it practically never fails. You can just use this as a foundation and try to find your own combo if you'd like. I know a lot of people have been using a similar combo to the one that you're about to see. Now this one is really cool as well, but at the same time this has chances of missing, so it's not 100% reliable, but feel free to do it if you really wanted to. And with that, we end the video and finally got to the end. Oh my god, I am so sorry if it took you... I didn't realize it was going to take this long to actually do this video. Oh jeez, but I do hope that at the end of this video, now that you do understand her a lot better and you can have a better time playing her and understanding how she works. Last minute remarks, if you are wondering if you need Chacona, no if you have S3. But if you have to ask for my personal opinion, I would highly recommend you get her anyway because she is just so valuable. If you really wanted to main Cartethiya, I highly suggest you pick her up in the future once she gets a rerun. Comment, like, subscribe if you want to. I would greatly appreciate it with how much time I put into this. With everything that's gone on this week with my PC getting a blue screen and me losing all my data and doing this video 4 times now. On the positive side, it's finally finished. I love you all so very, very much. And until next time, everyone, thank you all for watching.
And the victor is Cartethiya the Knight.